Okay, I just wanted to highlight this. I've spoken about this in previous Thicket forums. It's like a very small component, but the more that I've been thinking about it, the more that I think we've missed something that's really crucial in arid lands across the world, and that is crucial for when we consider Thicket. So the three questions I want to ask is, firstly, like, what is this water remoteness that I'm talking about? Why should we be caring about it? Why should we be discussing it? And how do we deal with it? So what is water remoteness? It is a very recent, it crops up in the literature very recently in 2008. There are a few earlier papers from the mid-90s that kind of start hinting towards this idea of water remoteness, but it's actually this Fensham and Fairfax that like made it explicit, and I couldn't find a paper earlier than this. And what it is it's just saying that we focused very much on animals, how water availabilities affects animal behavior, where they travel, where they feed, these kind of ideas. But we haven't focused on what impact that has on plant communities other than close to water sources. Those that have heard of the biosphere effect, where there's trampling and there's a lot of detrimental effects on plant communities close to water, that's where most of the research has been focused. So it's this idea that grazing, so this was an Australian system, so most of the work that's been done on water remoteness has been done in Australia, and there they've got grazing system in the arid zone, and the further away you are from water, because many of the herbivores in this system are water dependent, the further away you are, the less impact these herbivores have on the vegetation communities. I don't like that definition. So when I started thinking about this, I came up with this idea of thirst refugia, which are areas that are far enough away from water for plant communities to be unmolested by herbivores. So, it's a refugia because it's too thirsty to get there. By the time you've got there, you want to turn around and head back to the closest water source. And we have a lot of water-dependent herbivores, elephants being one of them. Kudu are water-dependent as well. And the number of animals that are large browsers that are not water-dependent, they form a very small overall biomass in terms of the herbivory yield. So if water remoteness is a thing, there should be large areas that almost never experienced any herbivory. So what is water remoteness? Let's just go and look at this Fensham and Fairfax. They went and mapped this 11,800 square kilometre area, and they mapped every borehole. And in Australia, they've got these weird things where they create open channels, so they call them artificial bore drains. So that instead of moving water around was expensive, so they'd have a borehole and they'd actually just create a canal and kind of shunt water along the canal. And if you look here, the only natural semi-permanent water features are in the thick lines. And just take this away. So you can see that there are very few natural water features in this landscape. And the whole point about this is that they're trying to propose creating a water remote area, and this is taking this farm and also in the Australian arid zone. They don't have many fences. Regularly they shift their cattle long distances. Different areas in the Australian arid zone operate differently, but I believe this had very few fences. So what they want to do is take this farm and shut down all the boreholes, so that just that little sliver could be considered water remote, which is further than 7 kilometers from the closest water point for cattle. This then got updated, and welcome, Richard. There should be a seat. Oh, you've got a seat there. Cool, fantastic. So this paper here by Al Healy went and took this one step further. So they went and plotted out all of the natural water sources, and the areas in red here are further then they're 50 to 75 kilometers away from water. Okay, so anything in the red is like 15 to 20. This is what the present day situation looks like. You can see that those thirst refugia, water remote areas have largely disappeared. Why should we care about this? Well, the major conclusion from this paper, few refuges for grazing vulnerable communities remain. Even low fertility landscapes show marked increases in water availability. And they argue that there's a need for removing artificial water points to recreate ecological refuges. And if we just go to the figure, this is why. So this is looking at how these animals are using this landscape. So here they're focused on the domestic shorthorn cattle in 2 zones. And you can see they are using track density, percentage of the herd, so tracking the percentage of the herd, dung densities. And you can see that after 5 to 6 kilometers, those animals aren't present in that landscape for very often. So not saying that herbivory is not going on. So every now and then you do find there's dung out there. So they are there, but they're very transient in those landscapes. They're not continuously browsing. And remember, often you'll have selective, in these areas you're going to have selective browsing, and we're going to start losing species diversity. And this is the list of species that they came up with that require, as soon as they exit a water remote area or an area becomes isn't water remote, it's now within the foraging radius of these domestic animals, these exponentially decline. So coming back to home, Australia versus Thicket, here, so most of this work on water remoteness has been done in the Australian arid zone. I'm struggling to find anywhere else that really talks about it. And so there they've got an open landscape, whereas we've got a closed landscape. So the pre-pastoralism, dense closed vegetation for Thicket would have increased water remoteness. So if an elephant is going down one of these valleys, and say it's slightly steep slopes, they're going to follow the water courses and stay close, even if they're just being transitory through the landscape. They're very unlikely going to walk up those slopes because not only is it a slope, but it's incredibly dense. So that water remoteness becomes it's how to put this? It's very short distances because you've got this barrier to make it, which makes those water remote areas become very short distances from water. Sorry, becoming tongue-tied. They had kangaroos and domestic grazers. We have mega herbivores largely and domestic browsers in Thicket. And I just want to say that there are some misconceptions about carrying capacities in Thicket. There was this absolutely seminal paper by Stuart Hill, which really helped us kind of formulate ideas of how Thicket worked. However, this whole idea that something like speckborn is adapted to elephant utilization, but not to small domestic ungulates, so we can kind of agree with that. But we find, so this was the idea, is that this kind of top-down browsing was fine, but the goat browsing is not. But we can see in areas like Addo that with there's no water remote areas, and there's an impact across almost all of the reserve. So one just needs to remember that just because we think that Thicket has got a high carrying capacity, I think that's a bit of a fallacy because of the water remoteness and drought in the system. So if we look at water remoteness in Thicket, I've shown this figure before. I haven't updated it much, but this, what you see here in blue, unfortunately it's not showing up. It's slightly better. You can see there are a lot of points in blue there, and those are all artificial water points that we've got. So if we were to come up with a similar similar map, we're going to have lost a lot of our water remote areas. And so there's a means of maintaining water remoteness was this refuge for many thicket species, and it's pretty difficult to establish now that the cat's out the bag. So I started making a list, and I realized I'd just go on and on, but I think there are a lot. These are the ones that immediately popped up, like Aloe africana, Tree Euphorbias, Cussonia, spicata. All of these things are, we know that when elephants have access to them, their populations start to become decimated. And so that kind of asks, well, if this is a biome that has, is used to having high levels of elephant or mega herbivore browsing, why do these species struggle? And I think that one of the potential things is that these species didn't have regular mega herbivore browsing, precisely because they were in water remote areas. So how can we deal with this loss? We could remove artificial water, but that includes dams, boreholes. There's a lot of human infrastructure that's gone in there, and that has a larger impact on utilization of the landscape. We could cycle water availability at these artificial water points with wet and dry cycles, but I would like to suggest that botanical reserves are the way to go in Thicket. So if we're doing botanical reserves, how many, how big, and how do we manage them? The reason why I suggest botanical reserves is because we can do as many as we want, and they don't necessarily need to be connected to each other. We don't need to, because even very small areas of thicket can maintain their diversity once they've become islands. And we can see this there's a lot of good evidence from Grass Ridge. There are all these different sized thicket clumps. And as the thicket clumps get smaller, that you don't get this kind of, all of a sudden, a massive drop-off of species diversity. What would suggest that we can get away with conserving fairly small areas out, so we don't need hundreds of kilometers for a botanical reserve. We can get away with a number of hectares, and obviously the larger the better. And the great thing is how to manage these things. Everywhere that we've just left them, we don't need to, it's great. It's not like fynbos, we don't have to burn it. It's not savanna, we don't have to burn it. We actually just need to leave it, and it'll be fine. So this idea of botanical reserves has been suggested before. Richard and Amanda Lombard and colleagues wrote this about suggesting that how to protect plants from elephants in the botanical reserve in Addo was to use botanical reserves. And here again, they show that across the park, the number of years that the whole area has been exposed to elephant browsing, there's a decline in the species richness of the important species. And here, and so there was a suggestion for more botanical reserves to be established. And as Sandparks is expanding their zones that elephants occur in, I would be strongly urging that more botanical reserves are established at the same time. So this is a zoom in of the botanical reserve in Addo, versus outside, and you can see that this just hasn't had any browsers in it, barely any. Now it hasn't collapsed. The ecosystem there is still functioning. Probably, I would argue, a bit better than what's happening outside in the elephant exposed areas. And we can make these areas a couple of hectares. So every time there's there's a new citrus plantation that's established, there needs to be an offset on that piece of land. I would argue that we should be demanding that gets put into a botanical reserve, because it just manages itself, rather than keeping it open and putting animals into it. There's an idea, most areas that are set aside for thicket conservation have got animals in them. But we need to get back to, I don't know why it's doing this, sorry. We need to get back to water remote the herbivory that would have happened in water remote areas, which is incredibly low, and the best way to do that is with botanical reserves. Cool. Sorry about being tongue-tied on this. Thank you.